Kai Pan of Morgan Stanley, Brian Chan, and Vic Chimono, here is the question. Warren, every year in the Berkshire movie, you did it again today, you use the clip from the Solomon crisis in which you tell Congress that you have warned Solomon's employees that if they lose a shred of the firm's reputation, you will be ruthless in your reaction. Clearly, reputation because of the SEC's action. Could you tell us your reaction to the lawsuit, your reflections in light of it about Berkshire's large investment in Goldman, and what advice, in light of your own Solomon experience, you would give Goldman's board of directors and management?
Okay, anytime you ask me these multiple questions, I may go back to you to get all parts. But, well, let's start with the transaction, because that's the important thing. A few weeks ago on a Friday, a transaction described as abacus was made the subject of an SEC complaint. I think it ran about 22 pages. And I think there's been probably sort of misreporting, not intentional obviously, but misreporting of the nature of that transaction in at least probably a majority of the accounts that I read about it. So I would like, and this will take a little time, but I think it's an important subject. I would like to go through that transaction first, and then we'll get to further into the questions posed by the people that emailed Carol. The transaction, the abacus transaction, there were 4 losers in, but we're going to focus on 2 of them. Goldman itself was a loser. They didn't intend to be a loser, I'm sure. They couldn't sell the piece, a piece of the transaction, and they kept it, and I think they lost $90 or $100 million because they kept it. But the main loser, in terms of actual cash out, was a very large bank in Europe named ABN AMRO, which subsequently became part of the Royal Bank of Scotland. Now, what did ABN AMRO, why did they lose money? They lost money because they, in effect, guaranteed the credit of another company, ACA. ABN AMRO was in the business of judging credits, deciding what credits they would accept themselves, what credits they would guarantee. And in effect, they did something in the insurance world called fronting a transaction, which really means guaranteeing the credit of another party. We have done that many times at Berkshire. We get paid for it. And people do not want the credit of the XYZ insurance company, but they say they'll take a policy from XYZ if we guarantee it. And Berkshire has made a lot of money guaranteeing things over the years. And Charlie can remember back to the early 1970s when we ran into some very dishonest people, and we lost money, and we lost a fair amount of money at that time because we guaranteed the credit of somebody that was turned out to be not so good. It happened to be some syndicates at Lloyd's, of all things, but they found ways not to pay when our name was on it. So ABN AMRO agreed to guarantee about $900 million of the credit of a company called ACA. They got paid for that, and this is in the SEC complaint. It's not mentioned very often, but they got paid, 17 basis points. That's 0.17%. So they took on a $900 million risk of guaranteeing credit. They got paid about $1.6 million, and the company whose credit they guaranteed went broke, and so they had to pay the $900 million. It's a little hard for me to get terribly sympathetic with the fact that a bank made a dumb credit deal. But let's look at ACA, because they were sort of the nub of the transaction. ACA, and you wouldn't really know this by reading most press accounts, ACA was a bond insurer. Now, they started out as a municipal bond insurer. They guaranteed various credits, and they were like AMBAC, they were like MBIA, they were like FIGIC, they were like FSA. And all of those companies, and we wrote about this a few years ago in the report, all of those companies started out insuring municipal bonds. Some of them started 30 years ago. And there was a big business in insuring municipal bonds. And then the profit margins started getting squeezed in the municipal bond business. So what did they do? Instead of sticking to the business they knew and accepting lower profits, they went out into the business of insuring structured credits and all kinds of different other deals. I described their activities a couple years in the annual report as being a little bit like Mae West, who said, "I was Snow White, but I drifted." And these bond insurers, and almost all of them did it, these bond insurers drifted in to insuring things they didn't understand quite as well, but where they could make a little more money. ACA did it, MBIA did it, AMBAC did it, FIGIC did it, FSA did it, and they all got into trouble, every one of them. Now, is there anything wrong with a bond insurer insuring a structured credit or something other than municipals? No. But you better know what you're doing. Now, interestingly enough, Berkshire Hathaway, when these other guys got into trouble, went into the municipal bond insurance business. And we insured things that were almost identical to what ACA or others had insured. The difference being that we thought we knew more about what we were doing. We got paid better than they got paid, and we stayed away from things we didn't understand. We never insured a CDO. We never insured any kind of a RMBS deal or anything of the sort. But I want to give you an example of something we did insure, because I think it will help you understand better this abacus transaction. So if the projectionist would put up slide number 1, I'm going to describe a deal to you. And as you look at this, is it up there yet? Yeah. Somebody came to us a couple of years ago. I'll tell you the name a little later. But a large investment bank came to us a couple of years ago. Now, we were insuring bonds regularly. We insured bonds here of the Omaha Public Power District that's familiar to many of you. We insured the bonds of the Methodist Hospital, which is 6 or 7 miles from here. We have told people that if the Nebraska Methodist Hospital does not pay its bonds, Berkshire Hathaway will pay them. And we've done that to the tune of about $100 million in their case. So we are in the business of insuring bonds. Now, a couple of years ago, somebody came to us, a large investment bank, and they said, take a look at this portfolio. And as you can see, it's got the names of a whole bunch of states. Yeah, it's up there. And very different amounts. I mean, it's got $1.1 billion for Florida. It's only got $200 million for the state of California. And they said to us, will you insure these states, that these bonds of these states will pay for the next 10 years? If any of the states don't pay, you have to pay as the insurer. And I looked at the list, and Jane looked at the list, and we had to decide, A, whether we knew enough to insure them, and B, what premium we would charge. That's what we're in the business for. And we don't have to insure them. We can say, forget it, we don't know enough to make the decision. But we made the decision, and we offered to insure those bonds for about $160 million for 10 years. So we collected a premium of a little over $160 million. And somebody on the other side, the counterparty they call it, somebody on the other side for 10 years gets an assurance that if these states don't pay, we will pay as if they did pay. Now and this gets to the crux of the SEC's case or a complaint in respect to Goldman. Somebody came to us with this list. We didn't dream up the list. Another party came to us. Now, there's about 4 possibilities. Now, I'll tell you who the party was that came to us 2 years ago. It was Lehman Brothers. So Lehman Brothers, there's 4 possibilities, roughly. Lehman Brothers might own these bonds and want protection against the credit. Possibilities, roughly. Lehman Brothers might own these bonds and want protection against the credit. They might just be negative on the bond market and in effect be shorting these bonds and using this method as a way of shorting it. They might have a customer that owned these bonds who wanted to buy protection against the credit, or they might have a customer who was negative on these bonds and was simply wanting to short it. We don't care which scenario exists. It's our job to evaluate the risk of the bonds and to determine the proper premium. If they told me Ben Bernanke was on the other side of the trade, it wouldn't make any difference to me. If I have to care about who's on the other side of the trade, I should not be insuring bonds. They could have told me Charlie was on the other side of the trade. So in effect, we did with these bonds exactly what we did with the bonds that were presented to them. Now, ACA said with the bonds that were presented to them. Now, ACA said with the list of 120 that was presented to them, they said there's about 50 of these that we were willing to insure. And then they went back and negotiated and took on 30 more of them. We could have said, presumably, we don't like Texas that well at $1,150,000,000, and we'd rather have you give us more Floridas or something like that. We didn't do it. We just took the list and submitted. So it was totally the other guy's list that we insured. In the case of the Abacus transaction, it was sort of a negotiation as to which bonds were included. Now, a negotiation as to which bonds were included. Now, in the end, the bonds that were included in the Abacus transaction all went south very quickly. That wasn't quite so obvious they were going to do that in early 2007, as you could see by studying something called the ABX index. But the housing bubble, really mania, started blowing up in 2007. Now, there could be troubles in these states that we insured. You can say they have big pension obligations, and maybe the guy who's shorting them on the other side knows more about that than we do, but that is our problem. I mean, if we want to insure bonds, in the case of ACA, in the case of MBI, they have teams of people do it. We just do it with a couple of people at Berkshire. But I see nothing whatsoever. I mean, if we lose a lot of money on these bonds, I am not going to go to the guy on the other side of the transaction and say, gee, you took advantage of me. I don't care if John Paulson is shorting these bonds to me. He has no worries that I'm going to claim that he had superior knowledge about the finances of these states or anything of the sort. So that was basically the Abacus transaction. I think the central part of the argument is that Paulson knew more about the bonds than the bond insurer did. My guess is the bond insurer employed more people than John Paulson did in his business, and they made what turned out in retrospect to be a dumb insurance decision. And for the life of me, I don't see whether it makes it any difference whether it was John Paulson on the other side of the deal, or whether it was Goldman Sachs on the other side of the deal, or whether it was Berkshire Hathaway on the other side of the deal. Let's say we had decided to short the housing market in some way in the early 2007. I don't think anybody should blame us for taking our position. If we did it, we didn't do it, or if we take it the long side. I think before we get to the other part of Carol's questions, I'd ask Charlie to comment on this. Charlie has a law degree and in other ways is superior to me, so we'll get his views.
Well, my attitude is quite simple. This was a 3-2 decision by the SEC commissioners under circumstances where they normally act unanimously. If I had been on the SEC, I would have voted with the minority 2 and not with the 3 who authorized the lawsuit.